席呀，毛主席，全世界人民热爱你，你是部落的红太阳，你是革命的伟大导师，你的思想是指路灯，你的著作是真理。万万岁，万万岁，万岁万岁，毛主席，全世界人民热爱你。毛主席呀，毛主席，全世界人民跟着你。毛主席呀，毛主席，全世界人民跟着你。你的著作我们天天读，你的话儿我们牢牢记。革命有了方向盘，战斗有了好武器。万万岁，万万岁，万岁万岁，毛主席，全世界人民跟着你。
毛主席的书我最爱读，千遍那个万遍又下功夫，深刻的道理我细心领会，只觉得心眼里头热乎乎。好像那旱地里下了一场及时雨呀，小苗儿挂满了露水珠啊，毛主席的语录滋养了我呀，我干起那革命劲头而做。一字字一行行，一边那个读来我一边想，革命的真理金光闪，句句话儿说在我的心坎上。好像那一表是打开了千把锁呀，心眼里升起了红太阳啊，毛泽东思想武装了我呀，我永远握紧手中枪，我永远握紧手中枪。
这一辈子忙的幸福，走一辈子革命的路，一辈子改造思想，一辈子为人民服务。毛主席的祖宗革命的梦是一片风光的大方向，学习他，换一换就迎今天，学习他，换一换你满眼路，学习他，不管让我活着，学习他，和你共产迈大步。
Good evening, one and all, and welcome to the latest live stream. Been away for a couple of days due to commitments to various other things. I hope that you saw the work that I did with the comrades from California the other day. I posted that on the Telegram chat. Very interesting presentation and discussion that I was able to take part in there. So I see we've got some serious toing and froing going on in the chat. Hello to Paul, who's got to head off to work. He was there early. Yeah, my apologies for the delay in this one, by the way. There's been a series of delays in various things going on over the past couple of days. It's why everything's kind of been put back a little bit, but we should be back on track now. So, hello to Kai. Hello to Ash. Good morning to Ash in Melbourne. And Hello and good afternoon to Lavitz in San Francisco. And Kai, your Mandarin's still more advanced than mine, though I am starting to learn. Hello to Red Star Betty, all the way up there in Durham, England, which is, of course, on the opposite side of the country to me, but I'm sure we won't hold that against each other. Hello to my comrade Terry, who is, of course, from the Class Consciousness Project. Good evening to Peter, who will catch up with us tomorrow. And hello to HM down there in Brighton. Hello and solidarity to Philbin over there in Rhode Island, USA. Red Star Betty appreciates the music on the stream. Well, as always, be sure to check out the channel I get a lot of this from, which is called GetChan. If you've not been familiar with it yet, it's an excellent service run by somebody who's basically running a communist history project via the medium of music. You look at these various different things that whoever runs that channel manages to dig out, and you see, well, you get an indication of just how deep and rich the culture of the socialist countries was and is. And with that in mind, I'm also just going to drop into the chat a link to a website I use when I want to get hold of some art for episodes. There's a website that contains a lot of art from the Soviet period, from the USSR. And you look on there and you can see the enormous range of artistic styles that the artists that were, many of which, of course, worked directly for the Soviet state and produced things that would be regarded as propaganda, though I would argue all art under the bourgeois mode of production is propaganda in one way or another. But there's some magnificent propaganda portraits there, but also some magnificent experimental stuff as well, from the 30s, 50s, 70s. And you get an idea by looking at things like Soviet movies, portrait painting, other forms of artistic expression, including music. And you see that this was a tremendously rich and varied culture that was not the grey and staid and boring place that the propaganda, a lot of which originates, by the way, with our old friend George Orwell, very much the Paul Mason of his day, portrayed this country as. And of course, it's the exact opposite in so many ways. Everything that you were told about the USSR and other socialist countries growing up, the thing you find, the more research you do into it, the more untrue it becomes, until you reach a certain age and you think, well, all of it was bullshit. Everything they told us was 90% garbage, and the bit that was true was wildly exaggerated. So check out that website there. Hello to 1916 Easter Rising, our comrade in Scotland. Hello to Search and Research, who apparently can't hear the music. Not sure why you can't. Everybody else can. Hello to Naylor in London. Hello to Paddy on the southeast of Ireland. Hello to RVA Klavek over there in Detroit. Our Search and Rescue setup is new. Okay, glad you heard it. Hello to Lee. Hello to Brian Gillespie. So, I think that's everybody greeted and in line with the program. So, what we're going to be going through tonight is, 4 main items. Firstly, the murder of Comrade Oleg Khorzan over there in Prednestrovia, or to give it its full title, the Prednestrovian Moldavian Republic. And then we're going to be looking at the latest Kerch Bridge attack, the end, as far as we know, of the grain deal, brackets so far. And going to be finishing off by looking at the stories around the Russian military and the figure of Sergei Shoigu, the Russian defense minister. And, well, why the hell is it that this apparently rather competent administrator gets so much wild hatred from the extremely online mega patriot brigade in Russia, and, of course, was a target of criticism by the mutinous / potentially defending his market share titular head of the Wagner organization, Prigozhin, during his brief mutiny recently. So going to be looking at that as well. So starting off then with the first story on the ticket tonight, and that is, of course, the story regarding the assassination of the leader of the Pridnestrovian Communist Party. And if you're not familiar with what Pridnestrovia or Transnistria is, it's the breakaway region of Moldova, which broke away from the Moldovan state as was established following the criminal and traitorous collapse of the USSR in 1991. The Moldovan state fractured in two, with a group led by a bunch of former Red Army soldiers breaking away from it to form a minority section of the country on the east side of it, bordering Ukraine, which has since then preserved certain elements of the Soviet legacy, which is very much dominated by a bunch of oligarchs, basically, similar kind of characters that you find in Ukraine or Russia. And what you discover by looking at the murder of Oleg Khorzan is that what the rulers of Pridnestrovia want to do in terms of their ambitions is to essentially use the independence of the country as a bargaining chip to barter for better deals with the government in Chisinau, the capital of Moldova, and also with both the Russians and with the West. So this is a very typically parasitic group that are in charge here. But first of all, we're going to talk about the man who was killed here, and that's Oleg Khorzan. And I'm getting a lot of this information from the tribute to him that was published by the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Russian Federation. And he was born in the Moldovan Soviet Socialist Republic in 1976, and he's been had been politically active since 1995, when he was elected to the city council of Tiraspol, which is the capital of Pridnestrovia, or Transnistria if you prefer. And he became the chairman of the Central Committee of the Pridnestrovian Communist Party, known as PKP, and then later became very active in the Union of Communist Parties, which is the UPC-CPSU. It's the umbrella organization that exists in the former Soviet states that seeks to keep alive something of the old CPSU. So it's or at least it was, something that the old Communist Party of Ukraine was active in, and of course Belarus, the Baltic states, where being a communist is very dangerous. It lends itself to the authorities imprisoning you, as has happened on numerous occasions in places like Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, to either communists or those who can be described as pro-Russian. And of course, participating in it also the communist parties of Armenia, Azerbaijan, and the Central Asian republics. In many of those places, communism remains something which is periodically suppressed, and often that takes the form of being violently suppressed. And Khorzan was himself imprisoned, even though he'd been an elected official in Tiraspol and an elected MP at the national level and had participated in the presidential elections. The so-called government there, which is in reality dominated by oligarchs, imprisoned him in 2019, and he spent almost just over, in fact, 2 years in prison before being released in December 22. When during that time in prison, he was repeatedly beaten, had to go on hunger strike, and was eventually released in December of last year, and immediately involved himself again in the local politics. And when he was killed, he was apparently, according to the sources in Pridnestrovian Communist Party and the Russian Communist Party, he was trying to work with the opposition forces in his own state and also in Moldova to build a joint opposition group. And to understand who might have been behind his murder, because there's seems to be a long list of candidates, you have to understand the political situation that's going on the other side of the divide, which is Moldova proper, and Moldova itself, which, and much like Ukraine next door, during the 1990s and in the 2000s, in fact, had governments that were significantly influenced by the bloc of socialists and communists that was headed by former Moldovan President Igor Dodon, who, of course, had also been imprisoned recently by the Maia Sandu regime in Moldova. And you track what's been going on in Moldova over recent months with the escalating energy prices and the political crisis that the government's rock-solid determination to deliver Moldova into the clutches of US imperialism, that the opposition that has generated is very large-scale opposition that has staged many demonstrations in Chisinau, and I've posted some of the footage from that on the Telegram channel. And prominent within this opposition is, of course, the socialist and communist bloc that's been in office in Moldova before. And Sandu, desperate to ingratiate herself with the US imperialists, has declared her intention to leave the CIS, which is the nominal successor organization to the USSR. In reality, it's basically a trading federation. It doesn't do a whole lot, but it's a big piece of virtue signaling to leave it. And it has generated a lot of protests, of course, because the Moldovan working class can see very well, just by looking over at the country next door in the form of Ukraine, where the likes of Sandu are leading them. So there's a big class war in Moldova, and that reflects, of course, across the border in Pridnestrovia. And the idea of the communist in Pridnestrovia and the communist and socialist bloc in Moldova coming together in a unified opposition against the Sandu regime and against the oligarchic regime in Pridnestrovia is going to be something that neither side of that wants, given that the opposition has been strengthening over time in Moldova and the people in charge of Transnistria are feeling increasingly insecure themselves. The idea of a unified cross-border opposition, the idea of a unified working class that crossed that divide, is something that they definitely don't want. And so they've tried imprisoning Khorzan, who must have been, as far as I can tell, a very effective organizer and leader of the PKP. And now somebody has come along and assassinated him. Now, the leading candidate for this is probably going to be one oligarch or another, or the state forces of Pridnestrovia, or perhaps elements within the Moldovan state, or perhaps more widely within, should we say, the European Union organization itself or NATO. But certainly the leading candidates are from Pridnestrovia itself. So I wanted to highlight this case because not only is it something which is very important in terms of the fact that this oligarchic government appears to have now engaged in what I would say is a panic move, because imprisoning somebody and hiding behind legal and constitutional norms, or attempting to anyway, is how capitalist governments usually like to deal with these things. When you get to the point where they're coming out into the open and assassinating communist political leaders, you know that the situation is heating up and that the people in charge are starting to panic. So this is a very interesting development, and so I wanted to highlight it partly because of that, partly to pay tribute to the man himself, but also because I wanted to just to conclude this by stating that for many of us, including for I think most of us who are watching this tonight, being a communist in the West is sometimes risky. It can lead you to lose a job. It can lead you, if you are an active and effective trade unionist, as some people I've met in this country have experienced, that kind of blacklisting from particularly the construction industry in Britain is bad for it. So it can lose you a job. It can even land you in prison for a brief time if you're engaged in a particularly militant struggle, or at least it can see you censored, it can see your opinions banned, it can see you, as I said, to be deprived of employment. And many of those things have happened, but mostly for, I would say, the majority of us in our lifetimes, the overwhelming feeling you get being a communist in the imperialist West is, of course, just one of perpetual grinding frustration, which can, of course, grind a person down and discourage them all the way into political inactivity, to drop out of politics entirely. But in many areas of the world, being a communist puts you at the top of the kill list for some very dangerous and very reactionary individuals who, when they feel their position to be under threat, will not hesitate to kill the communists first. And why is that? Well, it's partly because the reactionaries are always bitterly and viscerally anti-communist as their first instinct. And for the capitalists, this makes a brutal kind of sense, because they recognize that well-organized communist parties, or even just decently organized communist parties with some roots in the working class, even if they're not by any means the majority, can rapidly become a singular or at least very influential force within the working class when the capitalist system moves into crisis. And that is what is happening in Moldova and Prednestrovia right now. The crisis there, the political crisis, is building up on both sides of that border. And so those in power are lashing out, they're imprisoning their opponents, and now they're coming out and killing them. And so I will conclude this segment by paying tribute to Comrade Khorzan, but also to say, in that tribute, I also pay respect to the communists all the way across the world, where being of our beliefs puts you at the top of many a reactionary's kill list. And some of these reactionaries are, of course, far more serious than anything we have to deal with, at this moment at least, in the Western world. So a tribute to him, his comrades, and his family in their hour of loss today. I'll pause now to read some comments. Kai says, back in the 70s, my stepfather attempted to unionize garbage collectors in the New York area. The result was the mob-affiliated owner threatened him with GBH, grievous bodily harm. Yeah. Well, that is, of course, an issue with some elements of the garbage collection in New York. I think I'm right in saying that was portrayed in the film The French Connection. There was mob influence in refuse collection in New York and, of course, other areas of the United States. And, of course, dirty tactics by opportunist and right-wing union leaders in the United States were sometimes backed up by mafia contacts. And that's something which has recurred on a number of occasions during the history of class struggle in the United States. Right. Philbin says, rest in power, Comrade Khorzan. Very well said. And hello to Will Johnson over there on the incorrect side of the Pennines. Nothing personal. It's just a matter of fact. So, as we start off with that story, and we'll now move to the next item on our agenda for tonight, which is, of course, the story about the Kerch Bridge attack. Now, if you're not familiar with this, the Kerch Bridge was attacked last year, and the attack on the bridge prefigured, it seemed anyway, or at least it coincided with, the intensification of the air campaign waged by the Russian Federation against Ukrainian infrastructure and air defense facilities. And at that time, it was reported on by Kit Clarenberg, frequent guest on the program, that the British intelligence services may well have had something to do with that attack on the Kerch Bridge. If you don't remember it, they actually used an unwitting suicide bomber to do that. There's a truck driver who had driven via the Caucasus up through Russia, and then that bomb he had on his truck, that apparently unknowingly had on his truck, was detonated remotely as he was traveling across the bridge. The bridge was damaged, but it was back in action again in a few weeks. Now this time they apparently used a miniature submarine to detonate explosives under the bridge, because they tried to get at it via air drone attack, but all of these have been shot down by Russian air defense. Now, the usage of this miniature submarine has again led to the speculation that the British are involved in this. And I'll point you back to the reporting of Kit Clarenberg and the discussion I had with him at the end of last year, where he was talking about a document he'd had leaked to him where the plans of the British special services and their planners were outlined in this document. The whole thing was essentially a how-to guide as to how to wage a stay-behind operation, sort of Gladio-type operation against the Russian forces, and to strike at Russian infrastructure, and including the Kerch Bridge. And remember, Ukraine issued a stamp following the first attack on the Kerch Bridge because they expected it to collapse. It didn't. And it hasn't this time either. What did happen, though, was the killing of a man and a woman who were husband and wife, and the orphaning of their daughter. And this, of course, generated the usual round of like utterly pathetic jubilation from the sort of the NAFO paedophile squad that you get online, and various other characters who are engaged in the extremely ridiculous business of talking up NATO for a living. And does lead you to ask the question as to, well, does this matter? Is this something which is going to affect the war efforts and the situation in the front line? And the answer on all of those counts has to be a resounding no, because what actually went on is, of course, the damaging of a bridge, the killing of 2 civilians, but the bridge itself continues to be operational, at least on one side of the road, and the train link that runs across that particular stretch of water to Crimea continues in operation. So it doesn't damage the Russian operation at all. What it is typical of the way in which, well, whoever's making the decisions on the Ukrainian side, I suspect a lot of the influence comes from the British, an attempt to divert attention from the horrific mess that they have made on the front lines. Because remember, in the course of the June offensive, which everybody's now saying is slowed down or stopped, and Mark Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the United States, came out and said, well, there's a bit of a problem with the minefields. Well, who could have guessed? I mean, the very new technology that is minefields causes problems for armored columns. It turns out, wow, you can become a general in the United States, it appears, with a very, very low level of knowledge. But more seriously, the level of casualties across June were around about 26,000 killed and incapacitated on the Ukrainian side, which is a very, very high number for action just inside 1 month. And the way in which that this was, of course, first of all, hushed up. They tried to hide it. They tried to pretend it wasn't happening. And then eventually the stories started to come out in the New York Times, Washington Post, Guardian, Telegraph, all the propaganda outlets with a direct line to various ministries of defense and intelligence agencies that, well, the Ukrainian offensive's not going well. So, of course, it's now slowed down, apparently. They are apparently going for another round of this. Then they're going to use the much vaunted Challenger tanks that the British gave them and said, well, don't use them. But things seemingly have got to the point where now they are desperate to just throw these things into the battle and to see what happens. So the question of the attack on the bridge, it has to be understood in this light. They need to put something on the television in Ukraine or something online to show that they're still fighting. They're still able to strike a blow at the Russians. It's not much of a blow. Killing 2 civilians isn't much of a blow. They didn't even damage the bridge to the point where it'd be unusable. But it's meant to be, the idea was that back in September last year, when they tried to blow it up via that unwitting suicide bomber, that this was going to be part of their big push towards Crimea back then. Because remember, they were trying to carry out assaults back in September of last year in the Kherson area that were meant to prefigure a big push towards Crimea. Because this has always been the big idea. Either last September in Kherson, or now in Zaporozhye, the idea was always to try and get to Crimea, and then the idea was that the Russians would just panic and run away, and glorious victory would follow, or the collapse of the Putin regime. Of course, none of this has happened, and isn't going to happen anyway. Not then and not now. So this is another brutal bid to keep the news stories positive, that they can then, of course, put this in a clips package and show to drooling mouth breathers in the US Senate like Lindsey Graham and put on TV to show that Ukraine can still strike back at Putin. Of course, it's militarily meaningless and unlikely in the extreme to actually affect Russian decision making. So again, a useless and fruitless attack, which only achieved the orphaning of a small child, which goes to show the kind of calculations that these people are making. And turning back to the question of the offensive, the renewed offensive, they are now trying to get their hands on more outdated Challenger tanks, because the Challenger 2 that they've been provided with a small number of, I believe it's around 4, is going to be bolstered by their attempts to find then earlier versions of Challenger tanks that are now in private collections. So that's how desperate they're getting, because the British Army has been apparently very, very opposed to handing over more of their very small fleet of Challenger tanks to the Ukrainians. They're now trying to find more armor from private collections. So it would seem that this temporary slowdown, shall we say, of the Ukrainian offensive is going to move over into another full-scale offensive very soon, and that they're going to hurl more men fruitlessly at the Russian lines. And yet again, we see that this is Zelensky and the criminals in the Kiev regime playing their role as simply order takers of the NATO countries, particularly the United States. And as I said previously, Zelensky's only way out of this is if he essentially agrees to sacrifice many more thousands upon thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian lives in return for his own. And that's just the kind of man he is, and I suspect always was. But pressure will unveil perhaps who you really are, and who Zelensky is a coked up, self-centered sociopath who will sell millions of people into horrific death in order to preserve his own miserable existence, as are the rest of them in that clique that surrounds him in Kiev. They are contemptible people. And this isn't the first time that the bourgeois press in Britain and the United States have, of course, done shall we say, a sheen job on people who are just the scum of the earth. I mean, let's be blunt about the kind of people who've been running Ukraine for a long time now. They're all the scum of the earth. They're all people who would be prepared to burn the whole nation down just to walk away with more dollars stuffed in their pockets. As is, by the way, the Belarusian opposition headed by Tikhanovskaya. Same thing with them. They would burn down all of Belarus in order to get a few more dollars from the United States. Same thing with Sandu in Moldova. Same thing with the people like Juan Guaido in Venezuela. Same thing with the compradors in Nicaragua. Same thing with some of the compradors I've run into from people like the Iranian monarchists in Britain. Speak to any of these people for 5 seconds and you can tell that they don't care about their nation at all. They would all burn it down if the US told them to, and if they thought there was a few bucks in it for them. So that's the nature of compradors. And perhaps it's only really now, when I'm watching what's unfolding in Ukraine, it goes beyond the academic level. You can see just how low these people are prepared to stoop, just how many brutal acts they're prepared to engage in, and just how much destruction they're prepared to bring upon countries that they're always waving the flag for and screaming about honor and nation and patriotism. And of course, all they bring is corrosion and destruction and mayhem and the ending of the nationhood of Ukraine. Ukrainian nationhood's being destroyed on the battlefields of eastern Ukraine / western Russia by these people who wave the flag all the time and scream about the nation, scream about nationalism, scream about culture. All of it is being destroyed. They're destroying all of it. And who for? They're destroying it for the purposes of and the benefit of US imperialism. So we should never take seriously their claims to great love of country that these like fascist type operations like the Azov characters and the people linked to them engage in. When it comes to these comprador types in whatever country they present themselves from, they're all the same when it comes down to it. They're all from like the most degenerate sections of the ruling class that are completely tied by the apron strings to US imperialism. And there's nothing they won't do to follow the orders of US imperialism. Now, bear in mind that there are even worse compradors in the past in some bigger nations. So, for instance, the comprador ruling class in France in 1940 to 45 were more than willing to have half the nation occupied by Hitler as long as they got to run a vicious anti-communist and anti-Semitic regime in the other half of the nation, and that Hitler, they hoped, would do the job for them of the physical annihilation of the Communist Party of France. Now, bear in mind, it was around about, I think, 50,000 people from the communist-led resistance died in the war against the Nazis in World War II. So it was, again, a very real case that the communists were first on the list, and it was the Communist Party's influence in nations like France which caused so many of these compradors in World War II in the European nations to just roll over and just give up to the Nazis, because they were happier to see the Nazis storm in and take care of their class enemies in their countries and rather than defend their nations. What marks out somebody like de Gaulle is that he was actually an exception to the French bourgeoisie, not the rule. And yet he was the only one in the end that managed to preserve French capitalism, with the assistance of the US imperialists, of course. So, brief pause here. Hello to David from the state of Georgia, USA. How's it looking over there today? And Slava says, it's so hard to watch my home country getting destroyed as a sacrifice for Western imperialism. Yes, of course. Again, like, I've studied compradors for many years, and like you read about them, and you read about the kind of things that they get up to for their imperial masters. But again, like, you see something like this, like it hits harder in a way, because even though you know that these clowns are like all ludicrously anti-communist, very reactionary, but to see them be prepared to go this far, to see the whole nation just get burnt, and when they could have at least brought this to a close temporarily, but that would have risked their own safety, and they're not prepared to do that. So there is just absolutely nothing positive in these people whatsoever. They are the lowest of the low, and perhaps it's taken until now for even me to fully understand it. Even after years of calling myself a Marxist and using words like comprador, I think it's only really now that I can fully understand just the true horrific nature of what that entails. So, evening to Roddy. And Peter says, US British imperialists have to lie, because if they didn't, they could never leave their armoured vehicles and security guards. Well, very true. As I've said recently, what you have to realise about British imperialism in particular, but the US, it's true too, is that so much of what we regard as British success, British strength, is essentially a Potemkin village. It's a cardboard facade. And the war in Ukraine is cruelly exposing that. It's why they're getting so desperate, because they thought that this would be their big opportunity to break up the Russian Federation, get all the resources, unlimited and unfettered access to all these resources that they've been lusting after for many years. And it's all gone wrong, and they're being revealed to be very weak. They're being revealed to not be able to fight the Russians directly, just as they can't fight the Chinese directly, and they're being exposed in front of the whole world. So when people ask, like, well, you look at the position of like the Greek Communist Party, which is frankly just anti-Marxist and ludicrous, screaming about Putin, the anti-communist, Putin this, Putin that, and it's like, well, even if all they said about Putin were true, and I would contest some of it, what's being done right now is that the imperialists are being exposed as the paper tigers that Mao Zedong said they were many years ago, back in the 1950s. They can't fight. They have no ability to fight the Russian Federation. They have no ability to fight the Chinese. They're trying all these cowardly maneuvers to get the Ukrainian compradors to sacrifice Ukrainian working class men's lives to preserve this illusion of Western power. But it's an illusion which is being stripped away before our very eyes. And that's why they're getting so desperate, because they know very well that the fear that they carry, the fear that comes into the mind of particularly weak bourgeois leaders in African nations, some of the South American nations, some Middle Eastern countries, wherever is subject to the depredations of imperialism in the world. And you get a visit from the British ambassador. He carries with him the dread that many people will feel about offending not just the British but the US-led bloc, or even worse, a visit from the US ambassador delivering an ultimatum to hand over some resources, or open the country up for external investment, shall we say. And the fear that comes from that is a lot of it is based on the very real power that they exercise via their control of international trading systems. And backing that up, though, of course, is the threat of force. And then you see them being unable to fight what's in military terms labeled a peer competitor, and that they're afraid to fight a peer competitor, and that these are just the old term flat track bullies, and their power starts to diminish. And the psychological impact of that on many countries across the world, who are now prepared to turn around and go, we're not prepared to give you what you want. We're prepared to deal with you on the basis of X, Y, and Z. If they lose the ability to just dictate terms to a lot of these countries, they lose the ability to make these super profits on their movement of capital through these countries and the exploitation of the labor of these countries. And that's what's being lost on the battlefields of Ukraine from the perspective of the US and British imperialists, and France and Germany as well. It's that aura of invincibility that they thought they had is now they're being demonstrated to be the paper tigers they always were. And that's a tremendously damaging thing. So I'll just pause there for more comments. Peter says, do they believe their ideological fantasies, or are they getting accurate intelligence of how disastrously their plan is going? Well, there's two levels here. They, that is the servants of imperialism in like the press and the ideological people, they probably do, a lot of them, believe their own fantasies. They have to be so rabid and enthusiastic about it. The intelligence professionals and the senior military men, a lot of them know the truth. And some of the senior politicians know the truth as well. And particularly in the military, though. The British military, even though it's staffed by people who are rabid chauvinists, flag-waving imperialists, they've known all the way along that there's not a chance in hell that they can go up against the Russian military. They were clear about this in their testimony to the Defence Select Committee in the House of Commons in Britain. Over a year ago, they said that the British Air Force would, even if it sent every plane it had, which I think is just over 100, to fight in Ukraine, they would most likely get annihilated by Russian air defence. And that's before the Russians even put a plane in the air. And of course, they have no ability to replace these things quickly. As I've said on many occasions, without the massive industrial base that you would need to underpin such a war, which Britain doesn't have, and it's now being very much exposed that the United States does not have either, and without the ability to call upon the support of the masses, at least a portion of them, to be willingly mobilized and marched into the jaws of death, which is what this would be, you don't have anything. So they don't have the industrial base to be able to replace what they would lose in the first few days of a war against the Russians. And they don't have the political strength right now to call up the huge number of people that they would need to replace an army that would march into Ukraine and likely get annihilated. They don't have the political strength to do that. They don't have the military infrastructure to train all these people. They don't have the necessarily experienced training officers to do it, because they're not experienced of fighting against an army like the Russians. They don't have anything that would enable them to do this. And by the way, neither do the Poles. For all the Warsaw reactionaries screaming and gibbering and foaming at the mouth along with their friends in the Baltic states, they don't have anything either. They don't. I mean, what, do you think Poland's going to be able to take on Russia? I mean, this isn't the battles of the late 1900s where the Warsaw reactionaries managed to score a victory over the Red Army because of various military mistakes made by the Bolshevik commanders. This is going to be like an industrialized warfare, and they've got this fantasy that they can just introduce more Poles and Lithuanians into Western Ukraine and start fighting the Russians, and somehow it's going to remain just a special military operation. Of course it's not going to. They'll get destroyed. And again, like if the Americans then try to use that to intervene, well, the Americans can't intervene because they don't have the men in Europe to intervene properly. The reason why they had to do that call-up recently was because they lack, apparently, key specialists in administration and the technical side of things, including people like who know how to repair armored vehicles, to actually just keep up with the repair work that they're doing in Poland on Ukrainian armored vehicles, or US armored vehicles they've provided to Ukraine now. And so if they tried to get an intervention force going against the Russians, and the Russians treated this as a declaration of war, i.e. they didn't have an agreement with the Russians to essentially divide Ukraine. Well, what do you think the Russians are going to do if it's wartime and the Americans suddenly try and fly or sail over loads of men and equipment from the United States? They're going to start shooting it down. They're going to start sinking the boats. So, again, Mark Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and his immediate associates on the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and their more junior officers in the Pentagon, they know all this. They know all this because somewhere inside the Pentagon there are plans for war with the Russians, and they do have to have something of an accurate assessment of the military capacities of the Russian Federation, which have only, according to Milley himself, increased over the last year. So they know all this. That's what makes the exercises they're engaging in now, the pushing of more and more Ukrainians to their deaths, ever more cynical, because as Zelensky himself finally realized last week, they have no intention of coming to his rescue. If he's lucky, and if he's a good boy and sacrifices many more thousands of Ukrainians to the horrible death on the battlefields of eastern Ukraine, then he might get to go and live in Miami. Might. But there's plenty of people in Ukraine, I would suspect, who will happily see him swinging from a tree before then. So, Ash says, the Discord leaks in March about the situation in Ukraine said so much about how weak Ukraine is and how badly it is going for them. The government didn't deny anything except the casualty numbers. Why? Well, they didn't deny the information regarding how weak Ukraine is because it's just stunningly obvious. I mean, the casualty numbers have to be denied because that would be fatal if that was widely understood. I mean, I think it must be by now widely understood in Ukraine itself, because if it's the case that over 60% of the Ukrainian population knows someone who's been killed or wounded inside this war, then the casualty rate must be obvious to anybody who's not got his head stuck up his ass. But as to why they didn't deny anything else, I mean, they know very well what the truth is, and the truth even comes out in some elements of the stories printed by the New York Times, Washington Post, Guardian, Telegraph, other establishment newspapers, and even the Financial Times. They'll report that the casualty rates are atrocious, that Ukraine is very weak, and what that reflects is, I think, ongoing debates inside, or rows inside the imperialist countries as to how they're going to bring this thing to a conclusion, and they don't know how, because what they're desperate to do, as this is the case with any political situation, what they're always desperate to do, it doesn't matter whether it's the war in Ukraine or whether it's COVID measures at home or anything that is a major operation. When a bourgeois politician has staked so much, like all these characters have, on a certain policy, they are always unwilling to admit publicly that it has failed, that it doesn't work, that it doesn't deliver what they said it was going to, that it cost a lot of money, and in this case cost a lot of lives, and hasn't delivered anything that they promised it would. No bourgeois politician wants to be carrying the can for that. That's why Ben Wallace, the British Minister of Defence, resigned, and that's why the Biden administration is unwilling to admit anything that has happened publicly. They might leak it to the press privately, because they're desperately trying to find a way to make this thing go away now, I think. And the only way they can think of is to essentially, and this is the brutal, horrific reality, just make sure that Zelensky and the clowns in Kiev get enough military assistance to string this thing out as long as they can for as long a period of time as possible, in order that it can be downscaled in the headlines of the Western press. You look at the headlines in the press, you just go and take a glance at the newspaper headlines in Britain, for instance. Now, maybe this Kerch Bridge attack might make it onto the front pages. I don't think it will. They've all moved on to other concerns now. It's very rare that the front pages are featuring Ukraine now. And you can tell, just as you could tell when during the COVID period, when they just dropped the scare stories mostly by, I would say, early to mid 2021. Most of it had faded, but it was even fading in the latter part of 2020. There's clearly there that somebody has said, okay, well, we're moving on from this. And you can see that they want to move on from this. And what they want is for it to just fade away slowly so that they think, anyway, that people will just not notice when it comes to a brutal conclusion. What they don't want is a sudden dramatic collapse that makes them look bad. That's the truth. What they want is for it to just fade away, and then when it does come to a conclusion and Zelensky runs out of Kiev and the Russians take over however much of Ukraine they end up taking over, perhaps all of it, that essentially nobody really notices. Of course people will, but put yourself in the mindset of these scumbags that run the British government or the American government. They hope that just by media manipulation they can make everybody forget everything that they've said and done and all the money that they've spent and all the lives that have been expended over this. So that's, I think, the way they're looking at it right now. Right. Philbin says, Ukraine and NATO military strategy seems to resemble a Rube Goldberg device. The perpetual spring offensive goes on and on and on. Any day now. Yeah. Sad reality is that any day now is just turning into ongoing slaughter, of course. Naylor says, no sympathy whatsoever for Zelensky, but wasn't he basically threatened into the war by neo-Nazis in the country? That is it's a contested question. That's what I used to think, and then I read more about Zelensky and why he was picked to run by people like Kolomoisky, and I'm thinking that the operation involving him was on one level by people like Kolomoisky and his backers in the US and Britain, because there's some of the Ukrainian oligarchs have backers in the US state structure and the British state structure, some don't. Sometimes these characters like Kolomoisky are subject to sanctions in order to bring them under control. But there was an involvement there from the British and the Americans with Zelensky from fairly early on. And part of me thinks that Zelensky was essentially brought in to rebrand the Maidan regime. And the whole dance that was done with him and his TV show and the character that he played on there, the clueless upstart who becomes president by accident, the whole rebranding operation that was done there, I think, was to take the image of the Maidan coup away from like the face of it being Poroshenko, who's this sort of dirty old oligarch who's been around forever, who's got fingers in many, many pies, who's got a long and dirty past behind him, and bring in somebody who's got the appearance of being relatively clean, who's got the appearance of being new, and so therefore can embark on the agenda that many of the oligarchs wanted, but do it in a rebranded way. Now, was he serious about the peace program? I still don't know. I know that some claim that he was, and that he had some kind of idea that he was going to bring about a peace and reconciliation move. Perhaps that's true. But he's also linked to by 1,000 strands to people like Kolomoisky, who were all in favor of the Maidan coup and the war and its continuation. So the full reality of what Zelensky was actually committed to, and did he change his mind, or was this all part of a big plan all the way along, that'll only come out after this is long finished. I suspect that with Zelensky, him being an actor and having known members of the acting profession, he's a panderer, and he'll tell a different audience what he thinks it wants to hear at any given moment in time. And the more powerful the audience, the more he'll tell them what they want to hear. And there's no one more powerful, or at least it appeared that there was no one more powerful than US imperialism. And it's US imperialism that ensured that that deal for potential cessation of hostilities wasn't signed back at the early part of last year. So let's carry on here. So next thing I wanted to talk about was, of course, the potential end of the grain deal. This has been going back and forth between the Russians and the Turks principally, but also with the UN involved for many, many months. And the whole thing with the bridge attack now, and of course the Ukrainians using the shipping lanes of the grain deal to stage attacks on Russian military facilities, the whole thing now looks unsustainable. And of course this displeases Erdogan, who was making some good money, or the Turkish state were making some good money off milling Ukrainian grain in Turkish state bakeries, Turkish state mills that are run there. So this, of course, is something that he wanted to see continue. There's a lot of propaganda over the grain deal from the West saying, oh, this goes to feed starving Africans. It doesn't, of course. It never did. It was principally used to keep food prices down in certain areas of Europe, really. So this was a very cynical operation from the start, given that the grain deal was meant to facilitate the flow of Russian agricultural products back into world markets again, where they'd been sanctioned out of. But of course, a lot of this was never fulfilled. So they've got this deal which allows Ukrainian grain to go into Europe, principally Europe. And of course, this then created problems with Polish farmers and Hungarian farmers protesting very vociferously that it was damaging prices for their own products. And then the Polish reactionaries panicked and had to compensate their own farmers to essentially try and stave off protests. And then the Hungarians slapped a ban on Ukrainian grain. So, yeah, it was all about keeping prices down in Europe, and then it caused political problems for the reactionary governments of the East, who wanted to use that grain in their own countries to suppress prices. Of course, their own farmers, as I said, reacted negatively. So this was something that the Russians weren't getting a lot out of, and it was increasing political pressure on the Russian government to pull out of this deal. And it looks like now they are going to suspend participation in it. So this is, of course, the reality that's going to be talked about in a very distorted way in the Western media. Oh, Putin's starving African nations. Of course, if you look at what the Russian government's actually said to various African nations who've sent diplomatic representation to meet with Lavrov and Putin, is that they've said they're willing to provide agricultural products, including both grain and fertilizer, to African nations at a lower price than the world market has on at the moment. So it's a question of, again, the perception and the reality. The perception management that's going on with this from the imperialist countries is that, Putin's holding the world to ransom. In reality, the Russians were always looking for a way to get their agricultural products back onto the world market again, and it's the Europeans and the Americans who were blocking all elements of the grain deal that would have benefited the Russians. So finally, after many, many months of haggling, it's coming to an end. Erdogan's probably going to spit his dummy out in a major way, but then again, he spent last week appearing to give the finger to the Russians, but in reality he wasn't doing anybody any favours on the NATO side either. He was strictly looking after his own interests, as he always does. So yes, I'll pause now for some contributions from the discussion group. Hello to Zuleika, how you doing? Jeffrey Sachs confirms all this in his talk with the Duran. Interesting, I haven't watched that yet. I'll have to catch up with it. Third World only saw about 2% of the grain deal. This is comments from Ozwhistles. Why is Europe de-agriculturalizing? Very interesting question. Now, why you see protests from small farmers to medium farmers in like the Netherlands, in Poland, and in other places, why you see attacks on agriculture is simply that agriculture, as carried out in the European market, as carried out there, is simply not profitable enough. That's the brutal truth. If you look at what's happened to British agriculture, is very typical of this. If you look at the way that British agriculture has changed over the last really 70 odd years, since World War II, what you see is there was a larger number of small to medium scale operations that were run prior to World War II and during World War II, and ever since the end of World War II, 1945, what you see is a slow and steady concentration of ownership of the land and production inside British agriculture, to the point now where, of course, if you're a dairy farmer in Britain, it's very notorious for this, that you like make a loss on much of what you sell to the supermarket monopolies in terms of milk. And it's just not profitable enough, even with a high degree of mechanization, to produce food. If you're a small to medium farmer in Britain or Ireland or Europe, which is why you've got things like in Ireland, like they're cutting the amount of beef they produce. Again, whilst at the same time the Brazilians drastically increase the amount of beef they produce for the world market. Why is that? It's more profitable to farm beef in Brazil or Argentina, where, of course, the labor is much cheaper, the whole production process is much cheaper, than it is to do it in Europe. And that's the reason why Europe is seeing the small and medium farmers squeezed out, because, again, this is how capitalism works. The small and the medium-sized capitalist is pushed out. The land, in this case, will be redistributed and collectivized by bigger and bigger agricultural concerns. And the thing with the Netherlands protests is that was what was going on. It's a concentration of land ownership, a concentration of production into being controlled by bigger and bigger agricultural corporations rather than individual farmers. And this is dressed up by the Dutch government of Mark Rutte as, oh, well, it's all about a tax on cows' farts, or it's about global warming, or it's green issues. It's not. That's just the sheen they're putting on it. That's what the policy advisors have handed Mark Rutte to say. What it is the process of capitalism. It's the process of capitalism eliminating the small and the medium producer, concentrating production within the mega corporations that exist, who can still, via the fact that they can still depend upon the profits that are generated via the huge economies of scale that they are able to exercise, via that they can still make enough profit by producing within Europe. But mostly production of food is something which is passing ever more, and has been for many years, over to global south countries, where the production process is cheaper. That's what it's all about, fundamentally. And because, of course, this isn't something which is widely understood by either the farmers themselves or the political tendencies that support them, that's why you see people going on about, well, it's a plan to make us all eat bugs, it's a plan to do this, that, and the other. The actual reality is, of course, it's the process of capitalism. Pause for a question. President Jesus asked, wouldn't the shipping costs importing beef from Brazil negate the savings? Now, I must confess, I haven't looked at the precise details, but if you look at the production costs in terms of the operating costs of the farmers in Britain, it's still more profitable to bring all this stuff in from the other end of the world. And this is why you find so much produce from South America in particular in British stores. It still seems to be more profitable for them to bring it in from the other end of the world than it is to grow it and farm it in this country. If you look, like, I do a lot of shopping in places like Aldi, Tesco, Sainsbury's. So you can, you look at like the country origin of the products there. Yeah, you get a lot of like fruit and veg and some dairy products that are made here, but you start seeing like even soft fruit gets brought in presumably via either like refrigerated ship or plane from South America. You see a lot of stuff from Brazil, Argentina, and Peru and Colombia on the shelves of British supermarkets. And that's because this is just the much cheaper way to produce it, even with the additional transport costs. And that's why companies like Tesco and the other monopolies, because this is the other thing we have to bear in mind about the food trade, that it is controlled by both agricultural monopolies and the commercial supermarket monopolies that they deal with. There's only like 4 or 5 big monopoly supermarkets in Britain, and they control the food trade. So this is a case of like monopolization as well. So Oswhistle says, nice answer, thank you. In other words, the growth of the rentier economy in non-productive work has removed the critical work on food production. I would say it's more about just the natural process of capitalism. Like the way in which, first of all, the elimination of the small and medium capitalist is something which goes on constantly and has gone on ever since the 19th century, maybe before. And the concentration of production is something which goes on constantly. And in agriculture, we're going through another round of this now. And one of the things that was always haggled about in French politics, of course, was the fact that the smaller farmers, the small to medium farmers, still had enough economic and political power to get themselves a deal, out of the French state, and also something of a deal out of the European Union. And then when that started to get withdrawn, a lot of the French farmers, like 23, 24 years ago, started to get active with like the anti-globalization movement, because suddenly they realized that, well, French agriculture was going through this process which would see the small and medium farmer consolidated and essentially collectivized, have their land collectivized by a capitalist, and to see much of the production that was previously done locally exported overseas. So Zuleika says you should really consider clipping these and putting them on social media. This was really well explained. Yes, good point, Zuleika. Just on that question, I am going to be clipping these down into various different segments in the near future, starting probably tomorrow. So what I'm going to be doing is putting the clips on the YouTube page and the full live recording on the Patreon page. Oswhistle says, Envirotainer has made it economic to shift fresh produce by air. Well, I didn't know that, but that makes a lot of sense. Thank you. Slava says, the best food is when it's grown locally. It has the most nutrients. Spinach, for example, loses half of vitamin C a day after the harvest. Now, that I didn't know. Even though I grew up in the countryside, I know stunningly little about actual food production itself, but I know a little bit about how capitalism works. So, yes, to Slava's point, it is the case that what we should be doing, perhaps here it's worth turning to a brief discussion of what you do under a planned economy with regard to agriculture. So with regard to agriculture, Britain has the land capacity, and I know the United States has more than enough land capacity, to produce like over 90% of the food that the current population needs locally. We could produce much of what we need without flying it in from the other end of the world. And this is something which, again, like you can look at like the land usage in Britain. There's less and less land being used for agriculture now, and more of it just being used for the leisure pursuits of the ruling class due to concentration of production and, of course, the effective outsourcing of food production to the various other parts of the world that are more profitable to produce in. So you could, if you collectivized the land, or at the very least brought it under the control of a national plan of production, you could look at all the different areas of a country. We're using Britain as the example here, but if you're Irish, you can look at the large amount of agricultural land you have available in Ireland as well, and see that quite a lot of that could be farmed much more effectively, as it could here, as it could in the United States, to effectively grow decent food that is nutritious and not just processed garbage. that could actually feed the population effectively. You could do that if you got rid of the profit motive. You could do that if you reorganized agriculture to have it run on a collective basis, a collectivized basis, and as part of a national plan. You could identify different areas of the country that are good for growing one thing or another. You could identify the best areas for rearing sheep, cattle, other farm animals that would be butchered for meat. You could look at the best areas for even producing large amounts of fish, which we do now through fish farming and various other methods. So there's a real case when you look at agriculture that you can make there as to how the planned economy would be a hell of a lot more efficient and effective and better in health terms for the population than what is done to produce food now, and the amount of time it takes to transport it from one end of the world to the other. And actually, by localizing production, we're doing ourselves many more favors than just simply having it more readily available to us and not needing to ship it from the other end of the world. There is also the nutritional benefit that Slava mentions in her message there. So again, think of this and the whole controversy around what's happening with farming in Europe in those terms, because that's the correct way of viewing it. There's a lot of daft stuff said about World Economic Forum, stuff like that. And it's understandable that people are suspicious about these institutions because they're certainly not operating in your best interests. But in reality, these are just the faces of the mechanisms of capitalism that are constantly moving. So, permaculture is a good idea, says Oswistles. That's something I need to research more into. The more you read into the story of agriculture, particularly I'm looking at like agriculture in terms of collectivization in the USSR, the more I realize I actually need to know more about various different agricultural methods that were introduced back then. In the future, I'm going to be doing a program on Lysenko, the Soviet scientist who had a very maligned reputation. There's a lot of information now about how he might have been right about far more than he was credited for. And the trashing of his reputation was another case of anti-Soviet propaganda. For even though the man might have been wrong about a few things, there's a strong case to be made that he was right about much more. Slava says, I practice permaculture in my garden. Okay, well, I still don't really know what it is, but I would welcome any explanation that anybody can provide, and when I start researching this. So, moving on. Grain deal probably going to be, if not dead, then very nearly dead already. I think the only reason Putin hasn't come out and said it's dead is because, essentially, he still wants to keep a door open for further negotiations with Erdogan. So, keep an eye on that. Final point, Russian military and Shoigu. If you look, as I do, on a regular basis at the wild and hysterical end of Russian Telegram and Western fanboys of Russia as well, who are some of the most annoying people out there, who are desperate for Russia to like nuke Kiev or something stupid like that. You see that one of the things, and this is again something Prigozhin picked up on, that comes up over and over again, is this sort of wild hostility towards Shoigu, the Russian Minister of Defense. Now, why is that? Is it because, as Prigozhin says, the Russian Ministry of Defense is corrupt and they're holding his back, etc.? Well, if you research into it and look at the legacies of the period of the previous Minister of Defense in the Russian Federation, the guy who came before Shoigu and the people who came before him, you see that one of the things that the Putin government via Shoigu has been trying to do is to upgrade and professionalize the way in which the Russian armed forces are run, because the way in which they were run for many years, going back to the 90s and into the 2000s, was not just very ineffectual, but it mirrored really the failures of or the collapse of the Russian state in the post-Soviet era. And what went on in the 90s and the 2000s was, of course, this complete implosion of the state to the point where it was separating out into its component parts. And this is something that is of course very dangerous. And in the military, this manifested itself with various generals carving out essentially fiefdoms for themselves, that they were basically running their units, their brigades, as a sort of personal source of profit. They were essentially running a business there, and they were engaging in all manner of corrupt practices and making a lot of money out of it. So the hue and cry, shall we say, that's come from the period in office of Shoigu, and he's been in office for 11 years now, he assumed office in 2012, has to be understood in this way, which is that he and the Putin government have been trying to do away with the fiefdoms that were run in the previous period during the rule of Sergikov, the former Russian Minister of Defense, who was very unpopular as well. But he's been trying to professionalize things. They've been trying to get away from the fiefdom model that grew up in the 90s and 2000s. And if you remember the 90s and 2000s, one of the things that popped up in the West was all these videos of recruits getting brutalized and the hideous torture of new joiners into the Russian army, hazing rituals, that kind of thing. And a lot of this came from the sort of deeply ineffective and corrupt and brutal nature of the officer corps, or a lot of the officer corps in the Russian army, particularly the senior ranks. And according to other sources in Russia, Shoigu and others have been trying to essentially clear this out and get away from the previous era. And it is through that you have to see the complaints of people like Prigozhin, because they were losing, a lot of these generals were actually losing their fiefdoms, and of course couldn't respond by saying, I'm losing my ability to make money in corrupt ways off my military post. So they have to hide behind super patriotic stances. Oh, if only that Shoigu would get out of the way, then we'd march all the way to Lvov and we'd really show those Poles a thing or two, which is of course what Prigozhin was saying. And of course Prigozhin, it turns out, was more concerned with essentially his contracts coming to an end, in terms of his the money he was making off the contracts he had with the Ministry of Defense to run Wagner for them. And this was what a lot of his mutiny was about. And now, of course, he's slowly being stripped of these various different contracts, and there's various inquiries going on into his finances. Even though the big charge of mutiny or treason has been dropped, the investigations into his finances are ongoing. And eventually he's probably going to end up a very broke man, or a much poorer man, or a man in exile somewhere. And so the actual attacks on Shoigu aren't really about the fact that Shoigu is running the war. He's not running the war. The war ultimately is run by Russian general staff, or, of course, the general line on the conflict, of course, comes from cabinet level, from Putin and the collective decision-making body of the Russian government. That's where the general political line for the war comes from. So it's not the fact that Shoigu's holding us back, he's useless, he's weak, blah, blah, blah. The political line comes from the Putin government itself. The military, of course, implement this line in practice in the battlefield. And I know that it's said that, Putin's leaving everything to the generals now. I think he's leaving more to them. But the general political management of the conflict and all of its related issues is coming from the Russian government itself. As Oswhistle says in the chat, Prigozhin was on his way to becoming an independent warlord. Yes, he thought he was. I think, as was revealed by his attempted mutiny, he had a lot less than he thought he did. To a large extent, he believed his own hype. And the elimination of Wagner was, or the, shall we say, the restructuring of Wagner, which is what has now gone on, and of course the dismissal of apparently a number of recalcitrant commanders from the Russian armed forces, is all about the Russian Ministry of Defense now using this opportunity to push forward with their plan of professionalization and making sure that the Russian armed forces do not have these private fiefdoms within them anymore, because that's very dangerous for any state to allow. And of course, I would just add further that, again, we go back to how the way that the Russian armed forces, and prior to that the Soviet armed forces, the Red Army, has always been portrayed in the West. I've mentioned this before when dealing with World War II, but the image of the Russian armed forces, this corrupt, brutal and incompetent mess, all comes from that period from like the mid-90s through to about 10 years ago, where the period of Sergikov and before him, and the period of the fiefdoms, shall we say, that I've just been talking about, and all of the mess that came with that. That's a very short period in Russian history. The reality, of course, of the Red Army, and this is where I'll refer to one of my most hated bourgeois historians, a guy called Anthony Beevor, who's this complete propagandist for the British government, writes hack history books like attacking the Soviet Union all the time. He wrote a pro-Trotskyite book on the Spanish Civil War, again attacking the Soviet Union and attacking the Spanish communists. Again, like George Orwell would have loved him, and I'm sure he loves George Orwell. And the way he portrayed the Soviet armed forces in his book on Stalingrad and his book on the Battle of Berlin was basically just one step up from a Mongol horde. It was, oh, well, they just overwhelmed the Germans via a combination of getting lucky with the weather and having a lot of men be hurled into the German machine guns to the point where the Germans were overwhelmed. And of course, that's bullshit. It's bullshit that's even disproved from other British military writings. So there's a very long British military history on the Eastern Front, which I've got one part of. I'm looking for the other part of. I found it in a second-hand bookstore. And this old British Army historian, is written in the early 80s, actually goes over Soviet sources and wrote like a very accurate history of the campaigns on the Eastern Front in World War II. And what you find, of course, is that the Soviet military officers weren't these idiots who just like threw hordes of peasants at the German army to the point where the Germans were overwhelmed. They literally outfought the Germans. They developed very, very smart tactics to overcome the initial advantage of the more experienced German officers. People like Zhukov, Rokossovsky, various Ivan Konev, various other Soviet army commanders were very skilled officers and very skilled tacticians and strategists in the art of war, to quote the old Sun Tzu title. And they literally outfought the Germans in both terms, thinking and fighting. And so you find that the actual tactical battles on the Eastern Front, whilst these were very, very heavy in terms of casualties, it was a very brutal conflict, of course. The Red Army commanders were, by the end of the war, or towards the end of the war, were fantastically performing in terms of their ability to plan out the battles and maneuver around the Germans and keep them on the run. It's very brilliant tacticians, a lot of these commanders actually were. And as Kai says in the chat, the Mongol horde was actually quite tactically brilliant. It's a good point. I don't mean the accurate version of the Mongol horde. I mean the way the Mongol horde is actually portrayed in like Western literature, which is it's just this vast literal horde that overwhelms people. Might be worth doing a program on them in the future, actually. So again, I go back to this point because you have to realize that the way in which the Soviet army was written about in World War II, again, particularly after the end of the Soviet Union, before the end of the Soviet Union, there was a lot of propaganda, but certain military professionals had to write seriously about the lessons that they were going to draw from the Soviet performance in World War II. And even up to the 1980s, you listen to someone like Scott Ritter, who was trained to fight the Soviets, he will admit in a lot of what he says about that period in time that the Soviet army was actually tremendously well trained and effective. It wasn't just this huge mass of men that would charge forward screaming "Oorah," running over the American armed forces by sheer weight of numbers. No, this was a very well organized, very well supplied force that, yes, had its problems, as every army does. But again, the propaganda that has been published about the Russian armed forces, and the way that, of course, a lot of the politicians have just bought this is ridiculous, just as the propaganda about the Red Army is ridiculous. The true story of the Red Army commanders in World War II is a very remarkable one, and if you can find, I think you can find online Zhukov's memoirs, it's certainly worth reading. So, final comments. Ash says, yes to a program on Lysenko. Apparently his work was at the cutting edge of modern health science, but the bourgeoisie still call him a crank. Yeah, I have several articles on Lysenko that I'm reading at the moment. Lysenko program, probably in a couple of weeks' time, when I get around to actually finishing various other things off. Just to give you an update on, if you're interested, what I'm reading at the moment, I'm basically going through what you might call a Hegel binge. Again, it's another example of reading something years ago and not understanding it. I read Hegel's Philosophy of Right 20 years ago now, didn't understand it, wrote an essay on it at undergraduate level, managed to somehow get a 2-1 for it, didn't understand it. Basically just ripped off a loads of stuff from secondary sources and said, well, on the one hand, this source says this. On the other hand, this source says that. This is what they're arguing about. And the conclusion is, well, the one source says this, one source says that, one source says the other. That's basically how you write an undergraduate political science essay. So I've been going back and rereading, starting with Hegel's Logic, and its actual title is The Encyclopedia of Logic. And I've been reading that recently. It's not an easy read, but it's one where if you're like me, you'll go through 10 pages of thinking, okay, well, what the hell is this guy on about? And then eventually he'll make his point and a lot of things fall into place. So very much worth engaging with. I'm starting with the Logic because I'm remembering Lenin's old phrase that it's impossible to understand Marxism without having read and understood Hegel's Logic. So I took Lenin at his word and started to read through it. It's a bit difficult to get into, but I would recommend it to anybody. When I've finished reading that and a couple of other books by Hegel, including a return to looking at philosophy of right, I may do a program or two on them in the future. So we'll come back to that. So going back to the comments, Philbin says, the dishonorable portrayal by the USA West of the Red Army is constant and absolutely enraging. NATO, for example, glorifies Nazi stay-behinds in the Baltics, the Forest Brothers, on its YouTube page. Well, in a weird way, that's NATO actually being honest, because those are the kind of people who formed the backbone of NATO in the early days. So that's a very honest breakout there by NATO, and yeah, they've always glorified these people, and because they directly employed these people. They directly employed them in Western Ukraine after World War II. So the idea that the West had something against Nazism, it didn't. I mean, it got itself into a conflict with Hitler, again, for reasons it would be too long to go into now to go into the real reasons now. But they never had anything against Nazis as long as the Nazis were serving them and weren't actually in charge of the state. I think that's where in most cases they would draw the line. But if you look at the kind of people they rely on in Ukraine and South American states, across the rest of the world, they either rely on Nazis or religious fundamentalists of various different kinds, Muslim, Christian, Jewish, or Hindu in some cases. They rely upon these most backward, degenerated elements to be their boot boys, their hired thugs, because these are the people who will go out and fight for capitalism. They might not be told they're fighting for capitalism. They might be stupid and degenerated enough to believe that, Stepan Bandera was actually all about the Ukrainian nationhood. But that's who you get to fight for you. And that says a lot about your cause and the class interest behind it. That that's who's fighting for you. Whereas, of course, communist armies, wherever they've existed, either in the form of the Red Army or in the form of like Castro and the Cuban Guerrilla Army or Mao and the People's Liberation Army, they always, in every instance, try and raise the educational and political level of the average soldier. And of course, I've talked before about the strict behavior code for the PLA in China. Now, that's literally the opposite with the forces of reaction. If you look at like the Contras in Nicaragua and how they behaved, If you look at like the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, if you look at like, well, the Banderists now in Ukraine, or the men who backed up Suharto in Indonesia, or any anti-communist force anywhere in the world, it's always the most degenerated elements. It's always like the lumpens or the wilder end of the petty bourgeoisie. They're always as stupid as possible. The people who run these reactionary forces want people who are stupid, barely literate, and easily malleable, because that's who fights best for reactionary armies. Communists, on the other hand, always seek to educate and raise the educational and political level of the soldiers who are in any kind of communist armed force, and to, of course, enforce a strict discipline and behavior code as to how they behave towards the peasants and the proletariat. The reactionaries have the exact opposite way of dealing with things, which is they operate through terror and coercion only. Because, of course, that's how the class forces behind those armies actually dictate how those armies behave. So, more comments from Philbin, literally glorifying anti-Soviet guerrillas who fired pot shots on the Red Army that liberated concentration camps. Long live Stalin, long live the Red Army. Red Star Betty says, Indonesian reactionary death squads were vile. Hideous. Like, the general consensus is that it was at least 1 million killed by these people. Maybe as high as 2 million, which of course was done with the active planning and assistance of our old friends in the CIA and MI6, and with the active assistance of the British Navy as well, provided by Harold Wilson, the Labour Prime Minister at the time. So again, don't let anybody who's in the Labour Party ever fucking tell you that they're fighting for anything other than imperialism, because that's all it's ever been about. Right. Been going for an hour and a bit, so I think I'm going to leave it here for tonight. I'll be back tomorrow with a session focused on Mao's 1930 work entitled Oppose Book Worship. So we're going to be spending the hour looking at that tomorrow, which will be starting at around about 8 p.m. British time. So I hope you'll join me for that. Until then, thank you for coming along tonight. And thank you to everybody who's contributed in the chat. So I'm just going to go through the names bit by bit. Thank you to Paul, thank you to Kai, thank you to Ash, thank you to Lavitz, thank you to Red Star Betty, Terry, Peter, HM, Philbin, 1916 Easter Rising, Search and Research, Nyla, Paddy, RV Klavek, Lee, and Brian Gillespie, and Slava, of course, Oswhistles, so, and Morgan as well. So, thank you to everybody for tuning in. I'll be back with you again with the weekly Mao tomorrow.